Okay, I think we're gonna begin. So first and foremost, I just want to thank all our customers for joining, and I also want to thank some of the speakers that we have today as subject matter experts, and we'll get into their bios and intros in a moment. But today's webinar series is retooling operations with urgent and short-term production solutions that are safe and compliant. And so, with everything going on with COVID right now, we're hearing from our customers that they might need to put in production solutions that are going to be more temporary than permanent. And it could be, very simple things. And so what we want to do is we've got a host of folks on the phone that we're going to be going through a couple of different scenarios, and then we'll be opening us up to some Q&A. So with that being said, let's talk about the overall topics. So first thing I want to do is we'll start off with a safety moment, and we'll talk about that. We're going to go do through some bios and introductions of the team that we have assembled, and then we're going to talk about some of the business challenges that are currently going on in manufacturing, and especially with everything that's going on with COVID, there's urgent short-term needs that are affecting operations and the way manufacturing is traditionally done. And some of those needs, we're for sure going to cover. In terms of ensuring quality and compliance is going to be another part of this, that as you implement solutions, how do you make sure that they're going to hit your quality objectives and they're going to be compliant as you move forward. We're going to give one example, which is going to be a kind of a pick-to-light example, which really embodies error-proofing, or better known as poka-yoke. And so we're going to have an expert go through that. And then our own expert, Kevin Van Dyke, is going to talk about electrical considerations when implementing some of these short-term solutions and what you need to be thinking about as you move forward. And as I mentioned, we'll be going through some Q&A. So let's do just kind of a quick safety moment. So as part of FZ and our nature of who we are and the DNA of our company, because of all the projects that we have performed, we take safety in a very sincere way. And as we do that, we have safety directors, and I met with one of our safety directors the other day, and we were talking about, what are the obvious things around social distancing that needs to happen, and what are the changes that our own team is going through. And so, social distancing, we've heard it, we're living it. There's some great things that we're doing collectively in the United States around it. But as you think about manufacturing, as you think about your job sites that are out there, social distancing has to be maintained. And that is, how you handle your breaks, how you're going to be handling your on-site meetings, your stand-up meetings that you're having. So please continue that social distancing activities. As you guys are getting into breaks and you're handling your breaks within the plants, you're being affected, by these things. And you may have to, have different things set up in your break rooms, et cetera. You're probably going to have your breaks not all at the same time with people. And so, that social distancing is so important, especially as we get into this next phase of COVID. This becomes very, very important for you guys to consider. Next and foremost is clean and sanitize. Wash your hands, for sure. Try not to touch your face, as we've been told. Clean and sanitize frequently. The clean and sanitizing also is your work area, and it's going to be, not only your break rooms, your lunch rooms, and things of that nature, but the machines that people are working on, especially if you have multiple operators. And then last but not least, as part of our safety moment, if you're not feeling well, stay at home, right? So again, this is, we're hearing this, but from a safety perspective, just please keep these items in mind. So I'm going to give two simple slides about FZ, and then we'll get into the heart and soul of this. So this is not meant to be, a big commercial for FZ, but I want to make sure we ground everyone with who FZ is. So we were founded in 1980. This is our 40th anniversary, so we're really excited about that. We're headquartered in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we serve national and local customers. So we are a pretty big team. We've got 500 plus employees, and really we're focused on electrical and industrial technology services. About our services, we do industrial automation and control, we do robotics, we do industrial networking, we get into panel build. We actually have a really robust team around virtual design and construction, AV, prefab, and technology infrastructures in general. And if you're looking above ground or underground electrical solutions, we've got a great robust team. With that, again, I want to thank our customers for making FZ who we are. And without our customers and our great relationships, we wouldn't be here. So, for all of our customers that are on the phone today and on this webinar, we really appreciate everything that we can do for you. Give us a call if you have any needs, and we would greatly appreciate it. But thanks for being FZ customers. We really appreciate it. And we're here to provide great solutions for you. And we're going to continue to do that. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and I also want to give a shout out to the speakers for being here today. So Kevin Van Dyke, who is our Director of Engineering at FZ. He's a PE by trade in 15 states. He's an electrical engineer and has got a great background in designing integration. So we appreciate that. Kevin, thanks for being here. Jeff Smith, thank you as being a great partner with FZ. Jeff is the Chief Technology Officer at Dynex, who's also a Michigan-based company. He's got over 25 years of experience in architecting plant floor systems. He's active in the United States Council for Automotive Research and Controls Networking Plant Floor Controllers Group. And he's a technology guru and evangelist for software-defined networking. So Jeff, thanks for being here. And then Tim Stewart from Visual Decisions is here today. And Tim is been around the block with 25 plus years of experience, driven results, with a number of world-class companies in terms of 50% reduction in scrap, 25% improvement in throughput. So Tim is just a great consultant that has deep roots across many different industries and domains, including consumer goods, food and beverage, life sciences, etc. So our panel, thank you very much for being a part of this webinar today. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim, and I'll let you talk about some of the challenges that people are facing in this new environment. Hey, Tim, you might be on mute.
I was. Let's see. Thanks for the transition and introduction. And I wanted to start off by talking about some of the different conditions that companies find themselves in today. And the first is obviously, most unfortunate one, which is currently shut down, where they're not able to bring their people into work. Alternatively, they might be on very limited production, where they have just very limited demand and limited things going on. Then there's companies that are facing a radically changed mix. And let me give a couple of examples here. One is a food and beverage company that traditionally has had about a 50-50 split between serving the restaurant business and then serving the grocery business. And what they've seen is that now 95+% of their demand is coming from grocers as opposed to the restaurant business. And so what they've faced is a lot of challenges in terms of just retooling, packaging, and so forth, because a lot of what they were shipping to bulk was in very plain containers that were in bulk and so forth. And what they were shipping to customers was in smaller containers and packaged for consumers. And so what they've had to do is really change the way that they're doing their packaging. They had to do a lot of manual work. They had to change from 2 shifts to 3 shifts on the lines that feed the grocers and so forth. And so there's a lot of challenges that are involved with the change in mix there. Very similarly, I've got a customer that is probably facing a more long-term shift in their demand. They make water fountains, and the kind that go in the schools and buildings, and not the kind that's out in front of the Bellagio. So for those water fountains, they have the traditional kind where you just push the button on the front and the water comes out and you lean over and drink some. And then they've got a newer kind where they have the bottle filler attachment, and you fill your bottle by putting the bottle underneath there. And what they've seen is a huge shift towards those bottle fillers, because it's one less transmission vector for disease. And so a lot of places are going back and retrofitting. A lot of schools are placing orders with them right now for those bottle fillers. But they really weren't tooled up to create those parts. Their supply chain wasn't ready for that and so forth. And so they faced a huge challenge in terms of being able to shift their production over to that as much as demand would bear. And so those changes in mix obviously present a challenge. We've got other customers that are looking to change to build some medical device or PPE. Ford is a very public example of this, where they're trying to build ventilators for the government. And then other companies are just doing PPE, personal protective equipment, whether it's masks or anything else. And for them, they face a lot of challenges as well, and I'll get into that more in a minute. And then there are companies that are fortunately making toilet paper or something else like that just can't keep up with the demand. And good to be them. If we can go to the next slide. So for those companies that are still operating, that aren't shut down right now, what are the biggest challenges that they face? The first one, obviously, is how to keep workers safe and healthy. And Steve stole a little bit of my thunder on that earlier, but a lot of the things that you try to do there, alter your standard work so that you're keeping people 6 feet apart. You have to do a lot of things like looking at things that aren't necessarily production, but what are the different transmission vectors that are in the building? And so how do people enter in? Is there a single point where everybody's funneling through? If you have a time clock or something like that, how can you look at that and eliminate that as a source of transmission? Things like brakes, how can you stagger the brakes for people so that you're not crowding them all into the break room at one time? Things like that have to be taken into consideration as well. I've got customers that change jobs every 2 hours to protect against repetitive stress injuries. And for them, what they've done is, they put cleaning supplies at every single station. And, before you leave the station, you're supposed to wipe everything down. And then as you enter the station, you're supposed to wipe everything down, so that it takes a little bit of time, but at least it gets cleaned twice as you transition from person to person. There are companies that are implementing thermal scans as people come into the building. And there's a really interesting connection there with IoT. People's base temperatures can vary from 97.5 degrees up to 99.5 degrees. 98.6 is just an average. And so what you can actually do is you can, if you have this tied into like an IoT system, you can actually track what is a person's base temperature and what's their deviation from base. So that if I normally am at 97.5 and I walk in at 99.5, that might flag me as being sick. And then some of the visual and IoT tracking as well, to kind of track people's position within the plant and make sure that they're staying 6 feet apart. Some of the other challenges that we face, sourcing can be very difficult, if not impossible right now. Many of the suppliers are shut down. Some products can be sourced from other places. You can go to aggregators and so forth, major distributors, instead of going straight to the manufacturer to find out if they have an alternate supply, things like that. But if you are stuck with a single source, especially if it's from overseas, that can be extremely challenging right now. Demand has radically decreased or shifted, and we talked about that with the mix earlier. And then cost structures really don't match the current reality. If you just don't have the demand right now and you have a lot of overhead, then it can be very difficult. So this is very tough in very asset intensive industries, especially where they normally try to keep everything running 24 hours a day to amortize that cost as much as possible. Next slide. So if you are shifting to medical device or PPE, there are some concerns that you have to look at. Some things are compliance, which comes down to a lot of traceability and genealogy. And you have to be able to say not only what happened within your own factory, but where all of the parts that went into an individual item came from, or an individual lot came from. And so being able to shift into that industry means that you have to have systems in place that allow you to do that tracking. And some of those regulations have been relaxed during the crisis here, but there's still a lot of liability concern where if you're supplying this equipment for medical device or PPE and somebody gets sick as a result of what you have provided, there are major concerns around that, and you have to be able to have those traceability and compliance factors in place in order to reduce your liability. From a expertise perspective, obviously the lack of product or process expertise in those areas can be a major challenge to overcome, and you can look to some people that have worked with clients in those industries to be able to lend a hand and be able to guide you a little bit there. Sterilization can be a major issue for some of these items. So especially if you're making the medical device or even some of the PPE equipment in particular, sterilization is an issue that most companies don't face in their normal operations, but that are absolutely required for some of these medical devices. And typically you won't have that in-house, and you won't have the expertise in-house. And so you'll look to third parties to be able to provide that sterilization for you. And they're very limited capacity right now. So that's another consideration to take into account. Sourcing some of these individual parts and so forth can be very difficult. And then some of the timing of the product availability versus the market needs is a consideration as well. So how much do you want to make an investment into these items? And what is the trade-off with that revenue and keeping your people busy and keeping them on the payroll and so forth, as well as the societal benefit of providing these things that are in need versus the amount of time that there will be on market for these items, as well as how long it's going to take you to get to the point where you can deliver that, and how long you'll actually have for that market to be in place. So those are all different things that you have to consider. Some of the recommendations here would be to very quickly implement the track and trace, and there are IoT systems in particular that can go in pretty quickly that allow you to have that tracking and traceability. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are people out there that have worked with those medical device and pharmaceutical industries and so forth that have experience in those areas with the compliance and with the sterilization and so forth that can really help out very quickly to get you up to speed. And then a little bit more from a systems impact. If you look at some of the supply chain impacts here, from a forecasting perspective, last year's data, the data from the year before is absolutely useless for predicting what's going to happen next month at this point, for most industries, that is. And so forecasting itself is a very huge issue right now. Obviously, the current data is probably the best predictor of what's going to happen in the near future. And so you almost have to be able to adjust your forecast on a daily basis at this point and just reiterate that forecast on as frequent a basis as you possibly can, trying your best to blend the current data with your historicals in terms of mix and so forth to be able to have some estimate of what you need to build, where you need to build it, and where you need to stock it and ship it. Being able to look at your production planning, and it's a very similar issue here. If you're going into a new industry or you're changing mix, you're changing the process and so forth, you're changing your standard work, Being able to have a reliable production plan that you can actually execute on the shop floor can be extremely difficult right now. The standard times that you have in there, the standard routings and so forth may not apply. And so being able to have a lot of flexibility around how you do that production planning is critical at the moment. And then from a logistics and warehousing perspective, especially if you're serving new markets, looking at how you actually deliver these things to brand new customers is something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration as well. From a production standpoint, how do you actually implement that traceability and so forth? Something like an MES system would be great, and that's what a lot of those companies that are in those industries use to be able to have all of that genealogy and traceability and so forth. But it's not realistic to implement a full MES system within this kind of a time frame. And so as opposed to a full-blown MES implementation, something like an IoT implementation can get you up to speed much faster. If we listen to Dr. Fauci from the government, there's a very strong belief that this fall we'll see another round of this epidemic. And if that's the case, then being able to implement a system quickly that still gives you that visibility and control over the shop floor before then is going to be absolutely critical to keep people at work. From a maintenance perspective, if you're stressing machines in ways that they haven't been stressed before, being able to respond very quickly. If you have, lines that are seeing a lot more demand than they have in the past, being able to keep those up and running is very critical as well. And then from a quality perspective, if you're utilizing different processes, if you're putting something brand new in place and so forth, being able to create quality parts and so forth is absolutely critical. And being able to ramp up that quality very quickly is something that's very important. And to give more detail about how you can implement some of those quality procedures, especially for something that you're doing that's brand new, I'm going to turn things over at this point to Jeff Smith, who's going to introduce some ideas around Poka-yoke and how you can implement a pick-to-light solution very rapidly. Jeff?
Good morning. I appreciate your time. I appreciate FC inviting me to participate in the webinar. I think the information that you're going to get is pretty on point for today's day and age. What I've been asked to do is talk a little bit about a couple of solutions that we've provided for customers by way of example. There's some real challenges today with doing or changing your production around. Typically, we've got automotives and other companies who are doing production in a particular way. They're used to doing it that way. They've got policies, procedures, and infrastructure around that. And now they're being asked to build something they've never built. They're being asked to build something that may only have a time to live of about 6 months, and they may never build it again. And on top of that, we've got to airproof it. So if we've ever done any airproofing in the past, we know that sometimes that can be challenging. And that's for systems that you know and understand pretty well. So to do that for something you're putting together last minute or very quickly in response to something like the current health situation is certainly challenging. So there's a few things to pay attention to when you're doing that. Next slide, please, Steve. So how do you tool up a manual operation? How do you address those short-term manufacturing needs? And how do you assume or assure those short-term viable options are in place from an airproofing perspective? I mean, that's really the challenge. And on top of that, one thing I don't see a lot of people thinking about, or probably they should be thinking about and aren't, is if we're going to throw systems in place on our manufacturing floors quickly, how do we secure those? How do we make sure that we don't inadvertently allow access to things that shouldn't be? We don't inadvertently open ourselves up to some type of attack or even accidental problems. By and large, manufacturers who deal with cybersecurity problems on the plant floor, more often than not, it's a mistake or an error on the part of someone on the floor versus a malicious attack. So keeping that in mind as you move rapidly to deploy a production solution that may be well outside your normal wheelhouse, security is definitely something that needs to be considered. Next slide. So how do you solve the problem? In most of these cases, and in the cases where we've helped a few customers, their applications are very manual in nature. Obviously, with trying to go from producing nothing to producing ventilators in 3 to 4 weeks, you don't have time to have manual or have equipment built. Nobody can design tooling. I mean, there may be some companies that are small and mobile to do that. In fact, there's one here in my hometown that is, but they're a very, very small operation, and so they essentially can focus their entire workforce on building a very small machine. But by and large, that's not the case. And getting from zero to off the ground tends to be more of a manual operation, and it tends to be more effective to do it that way. Low cost, right? If you're going to build something for 6 months, you're not going to spend $4 million to deploy it, hopefully, at least from an equipment perspective. And again, if it's manual, there shouldn't be a tremendous amount of equipment involved. But in any event, however you spend that capital, however you spend that money to get to the production state, you don't want to spend more than you need to, but you need to spend enough to get to where you need to be. And that's really a challenge. Also, from an infrastructure perspective, and Kevin will be talking later about infrastructure and some of the requirements, but if you have to pull more than about power and maybe Ethernet to this operation, it's going to take significantly more time. If you have to run water, if you have to run air, there's a lot of things involved in that. If you have to run air, for example, you may not have adequate source for that air. So trying to keep the things you pull or the things you have to include in the system to a minimum certainly alleviates the infrastructure strain, infrastructure expense. And then how do you connect it all? If you have to spend a tremendous amount of time trying to secure that by traditional networking means, it's going to take time. It's going to be complex. It's going to lend itself to errors or issues. So as you noted in my introduction that Steve gave, I'm somewhat of an evangelist for software-defined networking on the plant floor. And by using a software-defined networking approach on the plant floor, you can very quickly deploy very, very secure networks. Almost as quickly as you can plug them in and wire them up, you can secure it. So that, for me, is a great avenue in this particular environment and many more. Steve? So how would I go about that? Pick-to-Light is an option that we've got a couple of customers who have come to us and we've talked about. And the reason that Pick-to-Light makes sense for operator interfaces is that if you look at the pictures that are included on this slide, it's extremely easy to deploy. It's extremely fast deployment. We can literally deploy maybe 250 Pick-to-Light stations in a day. And the reason it's done is the way this is designed, the Pick-to-Light options click into those aluminum tracks. So they can be placed anywhere in the track, and they're very, very programmable from the perspective of a single point of control. There's multicolored lights on the front. So it makes it very easy for those operations which require maybe someone to say, okay, how many things do I have to do here? And click a button when I'm done saying I've done that task, and then tracking that downstream. We've got warehouse applications that use this type of Pick-to-Light. We have got logistics applications. And in this case, it makes perfect sense to be used as an airproofing solution on a very rapidly assembled manual operation. Next slide, Steve. And the other thing that's nice about it is there's various deployment options that are available. So we've got customers who are deploying this using simply the Pick-to-Light modules clicked into that track, or they're using a combination of that and screens. Sometimes they're using barcode readers. We can tie barcode readers into the system, visual or fixed or handheld. We've got customers who want visualization at some stations, and sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not. Most often we find that it's easy to do this if you put, if you've got 100 stations in the middle of the line, but you've got visualization at one end and visualization at the other end. That makes it very quick and easy to deploy system without having to put visualization at every place. But again, it's going to all depend a lot on what the needs and what the specific requirements are. So flexibility is key. Next slide, Steve. So this is an example of a deployment configuration that we have customers who use. They will generally use one of our IPCs or virtualized environment or one of our DXDs. And they use then these tracked Pick-to-Light modules. And again, those modules, they click into that aluminum. It's almost like rolling out. You click this aluminum in place, you roll out the comms wire, which is a flat piece of wire that runs down the back of this thing. And then wherever you need to, you click these pick-to-light modules in place, and it allows you to very quickly address. And I think you can have literally up to 250 of them in a single instance. So it gives you quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how large or small the system needs to be. But I honestly can tell you this stuff can be deployed in a matter of a day or two, and it requires very, very little in terms of complexity. Next slide, Steve. This is probably the most common deployment we see. A lot of times we'll have customers who will have what they call the pack or unpack portion of the lines, or the load and unload station, depending on what they're doing. And they'll have visualization at both ends. And the visualization is more so they can scan a part, see the barcode, verify that the barcode is what they scanned, maybe get a list of basic information and steps, or possibly how much time it should take, from point of ingress to the manual operation to the point of egress down 48 stations later. And then at the unload side of that same solution, there's another visual indicator where they do the same type of thing. They can confirm some of the data. They can confirm that the part did go through every single station. It would be very doable with one of the smaller manual ones, manual pick-to-light modules, but oftentimes people want visualization there just so that they get a better picture, and it's easier to understand exactly what has happened to whatever it might be assembled. In this case, these were ventilators. So, next slide, Steve. So to kind of wrap up this conversation, and again, this was just kind of a snapshot of some things that some customers are doing, which are very, very easy to deploy, very, very low capital, very, very, can be very, very temporary, is how do you protect it? So in the case of network security or configuring connectivity between devices, you heard me mention earlier SDN, and you heard Steve's introduction that I'm kind of an evangelist for software-defined networking. Without going into a tremendous amount of detail, that makes it very, very easy to secure something that you're deploying rapidly, and securing it probably more so than traditional networks can be secured today, which is kind of a benefit. You get fast and rapid deployment and security. Think of every one of those switches as its own firewall and its own visibility into the network. So it makes it very, very powerful. And then at the head end of the line, we usually put, or we recommend an ICS Defender where we can isolate that equipment from the standard network or the traditional upstream network. And again, it makes a very complete wrap package so that if you disconnect this later, it's minimal intrusion going in and minimal intrusion or minimal disturbance going out. It makes it very, very, very efficient. Next slide. So next up, we have Kevin Van Dyke. Kevin is with FC, and he's the Director of Engineering and Virtual Design. Kevin's going to touch on a little bit of everything we've kind of talked about from an infrastructure perspective, physical infrastructure requirements, retooling, safety. There's a lot of things that come into play, and Kevin's got the experience and the credentials to really kind of wrap it all up and give you a good idea of what it is that you need to consider when you're deploying things this quickly and at the pace that many customers are trying to deploy it. Kevin?
Great. I appreciate it, Jeff. Thanks for that introduction. So the things I want to talk to you today about are really kind of trying to wrap all this up together and really arm you with some information that you can go back and kind of look at and use it as another piece of the puzzle to try to consider when you're working through some of these projects. So, I mean, as you heard from Tim and Jeff there, your business might be changing. There's going to be no question in the face of everything we're seeing these days. So you might have to quickly ramp up or significantly increase your production over the last month or coming up here in the future. So your teams are no question going to have to quickly adjust or react to those production increases or safety requirements. So I want to talk to you too about just some infrastructure changes that should be looked at carefully just to ensure code compliance and employee safety kind of in the face of the rapidly changing workload that you're going to have. So one of the first things, we're an electrical company, obviously, so some of the obvious things is you're going to have electrical and network connections that you're going to have to make. So really the idea here is you're going to have new equipment. You don't know what you're going to have just yet, but most likely some new equipment is going to come. And with that comes new infrastructure requirements. So one of the things that you're going to need is that equipment is going to possibly need electricity, data, compressed air. They mentioned that again. Jeff mentioned that earlier too. Maybe water systems too. So it's easy to say I need that piece of equipment, bring it in. But there's some ancillary stuff that comes with that. And like I said, electrical, network, data, and air. This equipment might also be put in places where maybe that infrastructure didn't currently exist. So you're going to take that piece of equipment and you're going to slide it over for social distancing requirements. Maybe you need to keep your operators a little bit more separate there. So you're going to slide some stuff around. Was there a power drop there? Is there a network drop there? Well, there used to be, but it was closer to that other machine. So now we may need to run another line. So just another example that you're going to have to utilize. You may have to use some warehousing that you have, and this is going to be a new production space now. So the infrastructure that's sitting around here was set up for warehousing, not necessarily manufacturing too. So at the same time, you're going to have new tools. Jeff and Tim both mentioned some really good tools between the pick to light application, thermometers, scanners, new parochial tests. Those are all things that you're going to have to add to that. And all those tools come with needs and requirements. One of Jeff's slides there showed a really good example of all the things that say come into the HMI interface. It was Ethernet and power, and it's those kind of considerations that it's easy to buy the piece of equipment, and then what's the stuff that comes around it. So really you come to a decision time. What are you going to do to make those infrastructure requirements changes? Are you going to make them temporary, or they're going to make them permanent? So really some thought considerations that we put into that we can help you walk through and just arm you with questions to ask yourself and your team. So from a temporary standpoint, what's the turnaround on this? Do you need to get this done right now? Are your customers asking for product right now, potentially this week or this day? So you may need that quick turnaround. You may need some more attention to safety if that's going to be a quick turnaround. Is this a short-term solution, or is this the new norm? Now, none of us can really predict that given how quickly everything's changing these days, but you've got an idea of whether this is a production technique that you're going to have to need in the long run. And that duration is really going to be up to you, but you know, is this just something you got to quick figure out right now for the rest of this week, or is this something that could potentially be 6 to 12 months down the road? It really dictates at that point what is the infrastructure going to look like. Do you have cords and cables from a temporary standpoint? That's kind of just, think about extension cords, right? Like I need some power over here real quick, just run an extension cord over there. So really want to know how you're going to do that. Do you have a plug over there, or do you run an extension cord? You start thinking about some of the other needs that I'll talk about later. Are they coming from across the floor? Are they coming from overhead at the same time? And so you need to ask yourself, would an inspector improve? That's kind of like a sniff test sometimes. Is if an inspector walked in and he looked at that, would you kind of have a gut feel of whether he would frown or not? And so you're really trying to balance the nature of that temporary connection versus worker safety and code compliance at the same time. There's more of a permanent solution as well. So that's going to be more of your longer turnaround. It's going to have more increased safety around that. Like I said, this is a long-term solution. So this might be where you kind of come to the understanding of this is going to be my new norm. And so what I want to do is probably implement more of a hard solution here. So that's going to require maybe a little bit more infrastructure, some cable tray, more hard conduit, permanent connections to panels. It's stuff that looks like that. But really wanted to ask yourself, that's the decision time, and just these are the questions that you should really run through with you and your team to understand what are your needs are going to be there. Next kind of point of topic is really the electrical load. So then one of the other consideration is new equipment is going to increase new electrical load at the same time. So you think of the plug strip at your house, right? Like, so for my example, I always think about the area where you put your TV, right? You got one plug in the wall there generally, but you're adding things. You're adding Roku's, your Apple TVs, your televisions, DVD players, cable boxes, so the more equipment you add, the infrastructure kind of stayed the same there. So what do? You add a plug strip. Really, you've increased the load at that one connection point as you added devices there. I kind of use that same example. So from a manufacturing environment? Did you put a piece of equipment in there where there was a limited amount of connections already? Are you plugging things into existing plugs, or there's already machines plugging into there? You really need to take a look at that and really understand what that's going to look like. And two considerations you kind of look at that I've got listed there too are your electrical panels already at capacity? So two considerations there is really the loading of the electrical panels and also the physical nature of the electrical panels. So when I mean load is how many amps and how many watts are running through that panel. Do you even know how much is currently running through that equipment? Can you look at, I got a lot of heating equipment on this panel already. I got to add another piece of heating equipment that's really going to ramp up the load there. Is that going to be a safe place to land this wire? If not, you got to actually, you're going to have potentially an accidental shutdown of existing equipment by overloading it. So are you going to create a scenario that actually might be, more detrimental to your manufacturing operations than you might originally have intended? You're just trying to quick add this piece of equipment, and now you have to deal with other shutdown equipment too. And then there's the physical infrastructure, the circuit breakers and the fuses there. Do you have enough circuit breakers? A lot of times in manufacturing facilities, there can be, older infrastructure panels that are already to the max. So adding more of that can be costly. So, you might plan for, that machine to be connected over there. And once you go to that point, you open up the panel and you realize all the circuit breakers are at capacity too. So now you've got, now you got to think about other options there. You got to go to another panel that's twice as far away. And really what you end up doing is you increase the lead time, and it can be more costly at the same time to implement that. So doing some of that initial work up front can really save you that headache. Having somebody look at it either from FZ or from a maintenance facility, really looking at it and saying like, hey, here's kind of what we want to do. We want to put this machine over here. And we can, using our eye or in your maintenance facility, know where your infrastructure is and say like, yep, we got plenty of space over there. That's the direction we should head before you get too far down the line. And wire size and circuit breakers should all be checked there. So that kind of goes without saying that the more times you add load to something, you think of disconnects, there's code compliant options to add a load to existing disconnects. But you really want to be aware of what's the wire size that's feeding that first disconnect in the first place. And so it's really stuff that can be pretty easy if the right people are involved on the front end. So I mentioned their visual checks and load studies for verification. There's really two visual checks, really just opening it up, checking fuse sizes for you, and just kind of giving you a gut feel while looking at that equipment and saying, yep, that's pretty compliant. I don't think that would be much of a problem. And that's one kind of casual, fairly easy way to do that. And then there's even more advanced where you're talking like load studies, adding power quality meters to equipment if you've got the time frame to do that, to give yourself an indication. That time frame can be days, it can be weeks, and there's a lot of information we can get in a short amount of time, depending on what your timeline is too. And we can make some just adequate and safe compliant plans for that equipment. And really the next, what it really boils down to is it's electrical and worker safety. So, at FZ, safety is one of our core values, our top core value too. So as you increase worker function, you're increasing capacity. Really what you're doing is you're increasing risk for your employees and your production staff and your maintenance staff. And so really we want to just keep the employer safety in mind while we're working on this as well. Having a few of these considerations in place are really just going to make a drastic effort and to make sure that the stuff that you're doing is not going to be detrimental to what you're trying to accomplish from a product standpoint in your manufacturing operations. So I mentioned cords earlier. Are you adding trip hazards? Those cords, are they running across the floor? Are they going to be sitting there? Can we bring those from overhead? Just a simple little decision there that can help, create a nice working environment. As your workers are moving faster, they might not be paying attention as much. So we want to try to remove as many of those hazards in place for them as possible. And then there's electrical safety from a hazard standpoint. I had a customer once where making some temporary connections, they kind of took the front panel of the cover off, made some temporary heater connections to the panel, and just kind of put the cover back on. Well, what it really did was the cord sneaking out on the backside of the cover, it created a hazard there. Someone could come by and have access to the energized components there. So really just want to make sure that there's fairly easy code compliant means to make temporary connections. And that's just an electrical safety things that we could do for you as well. The third point there is the equipment located in a path that was previously marked as a hallway or a high-low path. So as you're kind of making quick changes, one of my first points was, are you going to move equipment into locations that didn't have equipment previously? Your operations a lot of times have areas marked off for walkways. From a temporary area, do you slide some equipment away to create distance between different cells? People have muscle memory, and so old habits and behaviors could put people at risk there. An operator that was used to spinning around and walking in that direction might do that. There might be something in the path of that. So not necessarily an electrical hazard, but it's more of a worker safety hazard, and just something to consider as you look at how you're moving equipment around. One piece of equipment might not be that detrimental, but as you look at all your operations, moving many pieces of equipment could really change the flow of where high-lows are going to start going, trying to anticipate the path of high-low traffic at that point, and how is that going to put people in danger there. And then another consideration is any of the changes that you're going to make require new PPE for any locations there? Any new temporary connections to panels, are you going to put your maintenance staff at a risk by needing to go into electrical locations that would require them to have PPE? At the same point, are you connecting equipment to areas that you don't have normally connected equipment to? So when I think of arc flash hazard standards, a fair rule of thumb is closer to the utility is the larger the hazard. So are you using electrical panels that you didn't before that are closer to the utility? Do you have a good understanding of what the PPE requirements are closer to that utility source? You might actually click into a category of safety equipment that you might not have on staff. So are there any new PPE requirements because of those connections that are going to be required? So, and then the last point there is just overloaded equipment poses just new electrical hazards. Wires that are oversized become hot and they melt, and they can damage equipment with unintended consequences there, not only from a lost production standpoint, but just electrical hazards, arc flash hazards, and just failed equipment hazards at the same time. Really the idea there is just evaluations made from our years of experience, as well as your maintenance staff's years of experience. Is just having that evaluation on the front end could really save you a lot of headaches from a worker safety and electrical hazards later, and really just to minimize all that risk. And then kind of my last point there, just kind of in conclusion, just similar to my thought there, is just intentional thought on the front end can really help you minimize risk and worker safety. And so just having that intentional thought, it does not have to be time consuming. It could be simple as one of our account managers or project managers that is familiar with your systems. Similar that we do probably on a daily basis for all of our customers, is come in and just tell us what you're looking for. And tell your maintenance staff, just tune them into the operation at the same time, and they can help just give you a rundown of maybe any of the pitfalls that can really save you. And that's kind of building out that roadmap of where you want to go. Once you build out that roadmap of what you want to do, and just bring along people assigned you that can give you informed decisions on there. So by building out that roadmap and involving the right people on the front end, it's just going to give you that peace of mind. That's really going to just allow you more to focus on the stuff that's going to matter for you, that's just really meeting your critical production needs.
Excellent, Kevin. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask the panelists to open up your video again. And so Jeff and Tim, if you guys could just pop your video on. And Bailey, if we could just make sure we can get questions from folks out there, that would be great. So we're going to open this up and just do a little bit of questions and answers from from the audience, so to speak, and we'll give it a minute. All right, the first question that we have is from Susan, and she said, what are the first steps when defining a quality improvement project? Where should I begin? I'm thinking, Tim, why don't you take that one? How does somebody begin a quality improvement project? Where would Susan begin?
The first step for defining a project like that is defining the problem. You have to understand what it is that you're trying to solve before you can organize to solve it. So sometimes that's really obvious, and sometimes it's a little bit unexpected. But if you look at something like the DMAIC approach, the first step is define.
Got it. Excellent. Super. Like it. Next question we have that has come in through email. This is from Bill, and it is, for a pick-to-light solution, what additional infrastructure is going to be needed? I'm thinking, Jeff, that's probably best for you. So for a pick-to-light solution, what additional infrastructure should be considered, or what's going to be needed?
So obviously it's going to depend a little bit upon the requirements of the pick-to-light and the requirements of the operation that you're going to wrap it around. But by and large, what we've done here recently, it's Ethernet and 120 volts AC.
Okay.
That's really it.
Excellent. Awesome. Let's see. Next, we have John in facilities. Question is, and this is probably going to, Kevin, this is probably going to go out to you, but can FZ help me determine my power quality coming into my operations, and what's your approach for assessing power quality?
Yeah, so we have equipment, power quality meters for that use specifically. And so what we would do is we would connect that equipment. They're data loggers. We can set long intervals and short intervals to catch depending on what we're looking for. If we're looking for maybe disturbances in the utility, we can set really short data windows on that as well. If we're just looking to hit some historical data, we can just try to get the longevity, drag those windows out a little bit. But really what the idea is there is really getting characteristics of the voltage, power. So we're talking like voltage, amperage, and then power factor, any harmonics that the system will maybe implement, and really give you a clean idea of what the facility is doing at different times of the day too. So it can give us an idea from a capacity standpoint as well as from a quality standpoint.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you. So awesome. Really good. I don't see any other questions at this point, but first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for being here. I would also like to thank all the folks who logged in and were a part of this webinar. Again, this is going to be a series of operationally centric webinars that FZ is going to be hosting over the next 6 to 8 weeks. And I hope you found it informative, and we're going to be looking for some feedback on how we can improve these webinars. So a survey is going to be sent out to all the folks that attended this. So we'd appreciate your feedback. We only want to make these better, and so really would love to get some feedback on how we can improve. So with that being said, we're going to adjourn this webinar at this point. And again, thank you all for your time. And on behalf of FZ, please be safe. And if there's anything you need from us, don't be afraid to contact us. All the best, and have a great day. Thank you.